First, I want to thank everyone who organized this conference, Gennady, Oleg. I am very grateful to have this opportunity to present my work, which I'm not a doctor yet, I'm a PhD candidate, and so I'm at an early stage, and I'm very honored to present here. I am focusing on new approach rather than new sources, as you will see, because I'm trying to cross Cold War history with, so diplomatic history, a diplomatic approach to Jewish studies and Israel studies. In this paper, I focus on the Soviet policy, so it looks more like the Cold War aspect, but in the wider topic, I include more Jewish and Israel studies. So it all started with the question, why did the Soviet Union, traditionally opposed to Zionism, eventually support the creation of Israel in 47-48? After over 2 decades of opposing Zionist ideology, the Soviet Union shifted its policy to a pro-Zionist position. The turning point is May 47 with Gromyko's speech at the UN. And it lasted a very short time in late 49, and even some would argue before, like Yakov Roy, already in the fall 48, they progressively withdrew this very short support to the point of freezing relations in early 53. In parallel, despite claiming to oppose Jewish emigration from Europe, the Soviet authorities on the ground let the Jews, the non-Soviet Jews, leave Europe. So, sorry, I want my time, not just the cards. And so this was also an anomaly because it was completely different from the policy they claimed to have in international organizations and in their diplomatic policy. So I'm looking at the connection between these 2 anomalies of Soviet policy. Of course, the 2 topics of Jewish statelessness and of the creation of a Jewish state must be connected, but I'm wondering how Soviet policymakers connected them at the time and subordinate one to the other or not. Historians have mostly suggested important factors to explain this paradoxical Soviet attitude. In the first explanations that were given, and we had a view on it from Ziva's intervention today, was the proximity of ideologies between some Zionist movement, mostly the socialist labor Zionist movement, with Soviet communism and with collective life in collective agriculture in both the Soviet Union and British Palestine in the Yishuv. Diplomatic historians emphasized the Soviet aim of undermining British control over in the Middle East and in Palestine at the beginning of the Cold War, because the Zionists were more and better organized and more anti-British than Arab forces at the time. However, there were some Arab communists in many countries, and by voting for the creation of Israel, the Soviet Union actually condemned to death or prison every communist in every Arab country. So I'm not entirely convinced. I think they have a lot of strengths, these explanations, but they've been provided mostly from focusing on the Middle East, and I'm trying to explore the connection between Soviet goals in post-war Europe and Soviet goals in Palestine. Among the historians who did make this connection in a way or another, I want to present 3 of them. Laurent Rucker from Sciences Po in France focused on Soviet Jews, Stalin, Israël et les Juifs. And I believe non-Soviet Jews are actually more instrumental in this Soviet shift to a pro-Zionist policy. Oh, sorry. Yes, I don't hear myself. Is it better now? Okay. Another one is an Israeli historian, Aryeh Kochavi from Haifa, who worked on how British policy connected the Jewish displaced person in post-war Europe and the creation of Israel. And he looked a little at Soviet policy, but mostly from British archives. And in Poland, Bożena Żajnak worked on Polish-Israeli relations with the Soviet Union as a distant authority on Polish foreign policy. So my work attempts to complete these existing explanations by exploring how the Soviet Union difficulties in Europe provide this missing key to understanding its policy on British Palestine through the instrumentalization of non-Soviet Jewish refugees. And my case study is mostly Polish Jews who spent, 70% of them spent the war in the Soviet Union. 70% of the survivors. In the post-war, early Cold War context, Stalin's main goal was to assert Soviet control over Eastern and Central Europe. In Poland, his goal was jeopardized by many factors, including Britain's concerns about Poland's self-determination, also another factor is Polish anti-Semitism, which associated Jews and communists, and this was incompatible with Soviet policy of repatriating all displaced persons, including the Jews. And despite this policy, Soviet authorities has been quite lenient on the illegal immigration of non-Soviet Jews. This discrepancy, I believe, makes sense only in regard to how Soviet authorities thought they could use these Polish Jews, these Polish Jewish refugees, for their foreign policy. I argue that support for Zionism appeared eventually as the most pragmatic solution to get rid of the Jewish problem in Poland, in Europe. So I usually have a little background, but I'm going to go really fast on this because we had a lot on Soviet and Zionism already. Just a quote from Lenin, quote, "The Jewish national culture is the motto of rabbis and bourgeois, the motto of our enemies," end quote. From the beginning, nationalism, and especially Jewish nationalism, was necessarily in opposition to the communist universalist vision. But from the diplomatic point of view, in addition, Zionism had sought the support of imperial powers, the Ottoman Empire first and then the British, and therefore it appeared to the Soviets as a tool of British imperialism and not at all as a liberation movement. The Soviet Union tried to gain ground in the Middle East by encouraging decolonization, by encouraging anti-Western feelings of Arabs and non-Arab Muslim people. Nothing really could predict that Stalin would ever support Zionism. Yet, during the war, Moscow started to foresee how it could use Zionist eagerness for friendly relations. First, the Soviets thought to obtain US support for its war effort. Second, they wished to enroll Jewish communities, contribution to the war effort as well through the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And this more or less led to the first important visit. There were a couple of diplomats who went to British Palestine before him, but in October 1944, Ivan Maisky visited Palestine. He was the ambassador in Britain. He's the first official who suggested that maybe the USSR could support some kind of Zionist project. There is no question of state or not state at the time. But in general, in Soviet policy in the post-war era, Palestine was not an important issue. The Middle East as a whole was a place of interest, mostly for strategic reasons like the Iranian oil and the Turkish Straits, and for security reasons, because it's a very long border, very long south border of the Soviet Union. But the Soviet archives show that the Soviet Union did not have a clearly defined policy toward the Middle East at the time, let alone toward Palestine. There are even two reports, one from Maisky, one from Litvinov, addressed to Molotov and Stalin. And they even disagree on the policy to adopt on the Middle East. Maisky thinks that they should cooperate with the British to temper American ambitions in the Middle East, while Litvinov thinks the opposite, that they should use this American interest, new interest for the Middle East to limit Britain's influence. Palestine is not even mentioned in this report, and the Arab East as a whole is barely mentioned, and only as a potential tool to exploit capitalists' internal contradiction between mostly the British and the Americans. On the other hand, the Soviet Union had some very clearly defined goals in post-war Europe, which is what led to my assumption that Soviet policy in the Middle East was contingent to Soviet policy in Europe rather than the opposite. For instance, we know that Stalin was absolutely inflexible about Soviet right to keep the territories it acquired in 1939, including Eastern Poland. Controlling Poland was really essential. It was on the way between Berlin and Moscow, and it was essential to the Soviet perception of territorial security. Yet in Poland, Moscow met anti-Russian, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic populations. And in Poland especially, the Soviet diplomacy feared the British pressure against Soviet occupation. So in this context, it seems obvious that Europe was the main concern of Soviet policy, and the instrumentalization of Polish Jews started here with their repatriation from the Soviet rear, which was not obvious from the beginning. I mean, it's only after many agreements with the Poles that Jews were eventually included in this repatriation of the Poles into Poland from the Soviet Union. So initially, Stalin thought that he could use Polish Jews. I mean, there are some hints that he could use the Jews, which were less anti-Soviet than the Poles, to consolidate his control over Poland. And there were some Jews in all levels of administration, we'll see. When this strategy did not work, Stalin redefined another role for the Jews in Poland by their presence in Poland revealed Polish anti-Semitism, which helped him legitimate the occupation of Poland in the international arena. So through a series of agreements between Poland and the Soviet Union, Poles are allowed to go back to Poland, and among them, depending on who you ask, between 150 and 190,000 were Jews. So Gomulka didn't think that the Jews could participate in the Sovietization of Poland. Apparently he knew better, but there are some hints that, that Stalin could count on this, hoped to count on this. Yet Polish anti-Semitism, old and new, old from Catholic tradition and new from reprisal against collaborators with the Soviet occupier, Soviet authorities, even during the 39-41 time of the war, fueled by the fact that 70% of those Jews spent the war in the Soviet Union, didn't do well in the Polish society, and seeing the Jews in the communist government, there were a few Jews in the Lublin committee, seeing the Jews at a lot of local and regional levels of the new administration had the reverse effect. Anti-Semitism reinforced anti-Sovietism and vice versa. So the Jews became the main target of popular vengeance in Poland, and they wanted to immigrate as well. So this maybe first intention of Stalin, this first use he could have had of the Polish Jews did not work. So in front of this, anti-Semitism, the fact that everything did not work like he intended, repatriation should have stopped if the administration of Poland was the aim of letting the Jews return. Already? I'm at 12 minutes. Okay. Okay. So this repatriation didn't stop because Soviet policymakers saw this outcry of anti-Semitism, how they could use it to their advantage, not on the Polish scene, but in the international arena. So while authorities tried to address the problem of anti-Semitism in Poland, they systematically blamed it on anti-government and reactionary forces to use anti-Semitic violence to justify Soviet occupation of Poland. But after this was firmly established, what to do with the Jews left in Poland to break this cycle that anti-Semitism fueled anti-communism, etc. So, the Jews wanted to leave Poland, and actually both the Polish population and the communist government, except the Jews in the Polish communist government, supported their departure. The government, the Polish government, told the Jewish agency that, quote, it would not hamper, on the contrary, it would back the efforts of persons or institutions organizing the voluntary emigration of Jews from Poland, end quote. It even allowed Haganah fighters to set training camps in Lower Silesia. I mean, we have a lot of examples of cooperation of the Polish government with Zionist movements in Poland and Zionist institutions from Palestine. So the Soviet authorities must have known about this Polish policy. The question is, what did they think? Did they just turn a blind eye? Did they encourage it? Did they assist it? Apparently, it depends on the case. We will see. But how did it fit into their broader foreign policy? That's how one anomaly, letting the Jews leave, lead to another one, supporting Jewish state in Palestine. So I think that Soviet policy on the Polish Jews was reactive rather than ideologically driven. That's why it changed so often. Most scholarship assumed that the Soviet Union did not pay attention to public opinion, yet Tony Jude, in his post-war book, said that in Poland, they actually tried to convince the Poles to accept Soviet domination as a necessary feature of the post-war war. The Soviet insistence for the westward move of the western border of Poland, so that didn't gain any territory for the Soviets, only for the Poles, was actually to force the Poles to give them the fear of German revanchism, and so the Poles would accept the Lublin Committee in order to secure the benefits of Soviet territories. That's an expression from Tony Jude. Stalin even spared Poland from some of the reforms he usually imposed immediately on Soviet ruled territories. But the Jews became, I have 3 minutes left. The Jews became a problem because of Polish identification of Jews with communists. So this leads me to believe that Soviet leadership did not just turn a blind eye, but saw it with some satisfaction. In foreign and Russian archives that I took from Laurent Rucker, Moscow claimed that they were unaware and, quote, taking extreme measures against Jewish infiltrators, end quote. And foreign affairs infiltrators are the Jews who leave Poland illegally to the American, British, and French occupation zone in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Foreign archives show that these migration were scrutinized. De Kazanov, the vice minister, knew that Jews were crossing the border, and he did not suggest opposing their departure. The Bricha archives, in the Haganah archives in Israel, show some agreement that the Jews, quote, would be allowed to leave Poland without visas or exit permit. Assembly and transit points were established at the frontier with Czechoslovakia. This could not have been possible without Soviet authorization. According to both Britain and the Bricha archive, it can be assumed, quote, it can be assumed that this transit movement, which concerned most of the Polish Jewish repatriates, would not have been allowed without clearance from the Soviet authorities. The Jewish Agency archive also claims that a Soviet ambassador in Eastern Europe told him that all the Soviet ambassadors received instruction to push government to allow Jewish agencies' activities in Eastern and Central Europe. So why would the Soviet claim to forbid Jewish immigration when it was in fact facilitating it? According to British intelligence, all that the Russians were doing, that's a quote again, was to pass on the Jewish infiltrators to the British zone because they constituted a problem for them as well, end quote. So on the Polish scene, anti-Semitism was a source of unrest and convinced the Soviets to let the Jews leave. But how did this lead Stalin to support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine? He could just have the Jews left. So that's almost my concluding remarks. The Soviet official position in Palestine was anti-imperialism, stated by Foreign Affairs archives, quote, "The Jewish question in Europe cannot be solved by immigration to Palestine. Only the total liquidation of all roots of fascism and democratization of the European countries could ensure Jewish masses a normal way of life," end quote. We know from the Polish archives, from their communication with the Soviet government, that in late 1946, the Soviets did not feel, quote, "the need to take a stand on Palestine because Molotov believes that if the USSR took a stand on Palestine, the current disagreement between England and America would pale." I won't quote longer, but this proves that the Soviet policy on Palestine was actually coming from Cold War considerations in Europe and absolutely not from a hypothetical opinion on Palestine itself. Yet the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was also not ready to shift its policy, even in March 1947, so a couple of months before the turning point, which is Gromyko's speech at the UN. It was still highlighting the idea of a single state with same rights to both communities. But when the question was in UN hands and not anymore in British hands, so after February 1947, the Soviet needed to take a stand in order to have a role in this problem. So I'm going very fast on this, cutting half of it, sorry. Gromyko's speech in May 1947 at the UN is the first public endorsement of the creation of a Jewish state. It was a strategic move, not an ideological shift. Laurent Rucker says that Soviet archives are not yet clear on whether Soviet leaders ever considered the creation of a Jewish state as legitimate or not. Very short concluding remarks. The friendly attitude towards Jewish refugees and the newborn state of Israel did not last. The fact that Soviet policy towards Zionism shifted so rapidly after the consolidation of Israel's existence is further proof that the USSR never supported Zionism for ideological reason. It was a strategy which ceased to be expedient after different things. And Galia Golan, who studied the Soviet-Israeli relations, said that because the British were out of Palestine, so incentive to support Israel disappeared. I agree, but I think that there is also a European Cold War factor to this. In 1949, the end of the first Berlin crisis marked the stabilization of the Cold War's European theater up to 1956. And then the Cold War is going to shift mostly into Asia with the People's Republic of China, with Korea, with the Indochina decolonization war as well, and to some extent in the Middle East, Iran, Nasser in Egypt, and Africa. So the fact that the USSR stopped supporting Israel long before it started to support non-aligned countries and mostly the Arab states is one more proof for me that the Soviet shift to a pro-Zionist position and the shift back to an anti-Israel position, again, was probably not due to Middle Eastern factors, but mostly to connected to its European policy goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Большое спасибо. Thank you very much for the interesting paper. And we try to reduce our time and for questions. And the first question to Professor Estrai.
Могу по-русски спросить? It's better in English, okay. Thank you very much. Very interesting, and especially interesting for me because I recently finished writing a chapter, an article on the second repatriation of Jews from the Soviet Union to Poland.
The 49-50 repatriation?
56 and okay. The second one. And it is really quite a messy field. I mean, messy in the terms to understand why. There are so many whys, why the Soviets would allow it and so. But still, about your period, yes, this moment, it is difficult to understand why would the Soviets, who certainly were many things but not so naive, yes, to dispatch Jews to Poland with the idea to have pro-Soviet support. Certainly there was a sizable contingent among them, and we know this book about 2000, the generation, the 2000 of hardcore communists who came and play really, I mean Jewish communists who came after the war to Poland and played a significant role. But the bulk of them were really people who didn't want to accept Soviet citizenship, people who were in exile, people who were somewhere to expect them to be a pro-Soviet core in Poland. You know, I don't believe that Stalin or any people around him was so naive to expect them. My impression was that the first and the second repatriation, it wasn't the only factor, but mainly to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. Just to get rid of them, who needed them as later during this normal period of Soviet emigration. We know that they were trying to get rid or somehow operating in this field of the Jews from Lithuania and so on. They were less reliable and so on. So I don't believe that somehow it doesn't end up, you know, Jews to send them to Poland and then to allow to establish Israel in order to liberate Poland of this Jew when they could go to DP camps. So this is my question: why? Why would they do this sort of illogical thing?
Well, I think there is some Cold War considerations here. Is the stake of Poland in the Cold War? Like, Poland is really the place that the British are going to try to keep out of Soviet grips in the post-war world. So I agree with you. I'm always surprised when I read, but I read it a lot actually, even in more recent scholarship, that there was this idea that maybe they could be used to Sovietize Poland, but I think if it had been an idea, it was really short. Like, it was really, really fast. They realized that this was not going to work. And the Jews would not let themselves be instrumentalized like that because of all the post-war small pogroms that happened. And they wanted to continue westward or continue to Palestine, but they didn't want to stop in Poland, for sure. Feeding the Jewish displaced persons population was definitely a way, and I had to cut a lot of that for a time question here, but was definitely a way to also, I think, show the British that they had some, that they could be a threat, that if they opened the doors to Jews, not only from Poland, but from the Soviet Union, Europe and Palestine would be flooded with Jewish refugees. There were still more Soviet Jews than any other European Jews at the time. So I think letting them leave and helping them to leave sometimes, I also cut a place where the UNRWA, the Agency for the Refugees, the UN Agency for Refugees, were saying that the Soviets were helping Jews to cross the border from Czechoslovakia to Austria. So it was not just a passive attitude of letting the Jews leave. Sometimes it was active. And I think the threat, the veiled threat that if we open those doors, you will have not 250,000 Jewish refugees. And, oh yes, I don't know if I stated that the Americans, French, and British had already not signed, but agreed that morally the Jews were non-repatriable, so they were not pushing for them to repatriate to their country of origins, contrary to other nationalities in the DP camps. So the threat that 1 million Soviet Jews could suddenly be floated into post-war Europe, which was in ruin, in the DP camps, was probably one of the first Cold War weapon pressure used by the Soviets on the British and Americans.
Thank you, Sarah, for the presentation. I just wanted to follow up the Gennady's question and to mention that Soviet-Polish agreement of repatriation in 1946 deliberately and clearly, with no doubts, mentioned that only Poles, ethnic Poles, and Jews have the right to repatriate, not Lithuanian, Belarusians, Ukrainians, even Germans from Galicia, no way. So it's, in this case, I absolutely agree with Gennady that Stalin want to get rid of these troublemakers. But my question is, I think it's, Poland is only one fragment in the whole picture of the Central Europe, because almost quite the same processes took place simultaneously in Czechoslovakia to allow Jews to leave Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, to some a little bit different in Hungary because it was pro-Nazi state and all this situation with Communist Party was very big portion of Hungarian Jews. So in this case, the situation in Poland, in my view, should be compared in research with situation in the neighboring countries, in all this bloc. Because in my opinion, Stalin, as maybe the last great social engineer, constructor, he built this territory not physically, not only physically, when he shaped borders of the states, he also shaped new societies, like Soviet, but almost ethnic clean, not in terms of genocide, but in terms of reshaping of this whole this social sphere of these new societies. So in to what extent you in your research compare these simultaneous processes in these countries? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I actually look at other countries as well, not as much in detail, but I think they're part of the same process, but with different features. First, most of them are not as anti-Soviet, or when they are, like Hungary, for instance, they collaborated with the Nazis. So the British and the Americans do not question Soviet authorities on these countries because they collaborated. They occupied Germany as well. Poland was never collaborating with the Nazis. British and France went to war against Nazi Germany because it attacked Poland. So there was some, and there was another Polish government in London for a long time as well. So that's, I think Stalin at least felt more insecure in his occupation of Poland than he did in the rest of Europe. And the countries of Southern Europe, when you look at the BRICA, they're also, in Poland there is mostly Polish Jews. The non-Polish Jews live very fast when the camps are liberated. But in other countries, they're transit countries, more, I would say, than Poland. Poland is a transit for Jews coming from the Soviet Union, but it's Polish Jews and leaving. The others will be transit countries for illegal immigration by boat, or from illegal immigration by land to the non-Soviet occupation zones of Central Europe. So they're not only, so in Hungary, we don't deal only with Hungarian Jews. We also deal with the Polish Jews going through this country. Same in Czechoslovakia. Polish Jews go through Czechoslovakia a lot to leave Poland to the Western zones. So yes, one should take into account how it happened in those countries as well. And we have in some archives, again, the communication between those governments, those communist temporary government at the beginning of the post-war era, with the Soviet authorities, telling them to let the Jews pass through, let the Jews leave, don't block them from leaving, allow Jewish agencies' activities on these territories. So we can find some common feature, of course. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, доктор Гэвисон.